This one could push some buttons. We're going to talk about race in video games, so let's chat about it in the comments. But first, my opinion. I'm Tarmack, and this is Feature Creep. CD Projekt Red developers are even now having to justify their design of The Witcher 3 being comprised entirely of white characters. I need to place a caveat before you prior to getting into this. I'm a white middle-class gamer. I fully acknowledge an element of privilege inherent in that fact. However, I fully denounce the idea that simply being in possession of privilege means that I have nothing of value to say on the topic. I don't believe that you need to be a minority in order to make comment on an issue. The Witcher 3 controversy began with Tariq Musa over at Polygon and was continued in true bandwagon and clickbait fashion by the rest over a few months, including interviews with CD Projekt Red. Polygon had a reasonable opinion piece, but a solid portion of game media are grasping at straws looking for a story in this case, and it's just the 2015 version of the Resident Evil 5 controversy all over again. For those that don't remember, Resident Evil 5 was a terrible racist game because of the sheer amount of African zombies that you needed to kill. Of course, if you were in Africa and were killing a large number of white zombies, that might make you question the population distribution of Africa. If Capcom had made a Resident Evil game set in West Harlem, then I could see the potentially valid question of whether that choice was well-intentioned. The perceived racism in RE5 was simply because you kill a lot of black people, as though context is not the most important piece to consider rather than being ignored outright. But you get rewards for killing black people in RE5. Or, you get rewards for killing zombies and the game is set in Africa, so there's a ton of black zombies. Context, people. Context. Now, one can try to make the case that the reason few people of color are making articles about race is because there aren't very many non-white game journalists, and this isn't entirely true. Evan over at Kotaku, for example, has done a few well-written pieces on race in video games, and he's by no means the only one. You'll easily find more if you look, not even counting YouTubers or other private side critics and personalities. The industry itself does lack realistic representations of people other than white in video games. To claim otherwise is to simply be ignorant, whether willful or not. It is an industry dominated by white men, and it is logically sound to expect that those developers will default to white male characters. And that is the real issue at play behind all of the potential symptoms. It is the same issue that women face in gaming. The audience for games focusing on or dealing with issues related to women and people of color is there. Gamers want these games. But it is the industry that is having a difficult time making it past the marketing and development budget justification to build them. People build what they know, and white men, generally speaking, have less experience with race problems. However, it's worth mentioning that just because the representation of visible minorities isn't there doesn't mean that we can't have better character writing for people of color. I think it's somewhat incorrect to be overly concerned with black versus white, as that ignores the rather impressive plethora of human variation. Suffice to say, the industry does also have a writing quality problem, but I believe writing quality and representation of race breadth to be mutually exclusive issues. So, what do we get? Primarily lip service, but not through any nefarious means. Games like Skyrim, where you can customize your character and make whatever you want. The game won't recognize and respond to it in a way that is material, though. Many other games are like this. Mass Effect is another example. As a developer, you really have no choice. If you make a game that is widely inclusive, there is no budget on the planet big enough to make the game actually take into account race choices that represent the world gamer population. Not every story has to be a reflection of the values of the present day. Not every game needs to be racially diverse. Not every game needs to be a social commentary. In some cases, as with The Witcher, they're building the game based on existing source material. The Witcher story was one that was first put to paper back in 1986. That is not in and of itself an excuse per se to avoid race issues, but it's not a piece of art written for the purpose of confronting that. If you built a video game based on the Lord of the Rings universe, you'd have a very difficult time being true to the source material if you included dark-skinned, good-aligned characters because they're just not in the books. In fact, Peter Jackson got some heat for dramatically increasing the role of Arwen in the movies, actually writing out other characters so that she could have more of a presence. Tolkien did not write very many strong female characters into his story. This is why I believe the so-called racism relating to The Witcher 3 is nonsense. The idea of a set world, set unchanging protagonist, and such is why CD Projekt Red was able to make a game that is so good. It limits the range of development and allowed them to put all the time that they did into fleshing everything out. Are there downsides? Sure, there are always concessions in design when building a world, and using a pre-existing mythos dramatically reduces the potential writing required. There is also a tendency for the US as a general society to react to perceived offense on behalf of minorities more than other countries do. This is the result of the media culture that exists in the States. Very little of the Witcher controversy is actually written by people of color who are being overt in their offense. Rather, it is written in large part by white gamers offended on behalf of others who they feel must be offended that the game has only white characters. I have to be very careful in my argument here, as it's not my intent to attack the individual rather than the argument, but in reading the various articles out there, very little actual offense is communicated. Rather, I was left with the impression that the authors wanted me to be offended, but didn't explain very well why I should be. The logical extension of the argument of racism in The Witcher is that the offended must, by their own offense, be upset that CD Projekt Red chose the Witcher universe at all for their game. Of course, that is difficult given how few people have actually read the Witcher books compared to those who have just played the games themselves. Many specific items of design are present as a result of that choice, and the lack of people of color is only one of them. To have a more fair representation of people of color would require them to either not be faithful to the source material, or to not use the source material at all and thus make an entirely different game. And so far, this is not an issue that any of the articles I have read chose to tackle. Race is a difficult topic. It inevitably makes the author more careful for fear of causing offense. I did my best though, so let's talk about race in video games. I will ask that the comments be at least respectful, and blatant racism or insults will not be tolerated. This is not a small issue and it's worth discussing. Feature Creep is a regular show every week, so if you enjoyed it, hit that fancy little subscribe button so that I can offend you on a weekly basis. That's all I have to say. Tarmack out.